Okay, so we will come back to this initial question a bit later in the presentation. So I'm just going to switch to the next slide. If it will let me here, there we go. So as mentioned, my name is Amy Todd. I'm an educational developer with CITL, and I also teach per course in biochemistry. So as a sessional instructor, I typically teach when people are off on sabbatical. So for example, in biochemistry, they do typically take their sabbaticals every 3 years. They're pretty consistent with that. And so typically any given course, I'll teach it every 2 or 3 years. So I usually have a bit of a gap in between. All right, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience this past semester. And then we will kind of come together and start to look at different aspects of our own experiences, and we'll go into some breakout rooms. And then we'll come back together at the end and kind of synthesize some of those things and see what some of the main points were. All right, so for my own experience, I did not teach in the fall, but this winter I was teaching a third-year biochemistry course. So it's molecular biochemistry of the cell. So it's one of those weird introductory courses, but with third-year students, so advanced students, but it's still kind of a lot of new terminology and new themes and everything. There are about 54 students in the class, and our original assigned slot was Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9 a.m. So as a morning slot, I wanted to mention that because as a morning slot, it makes working with students in different time zones that much harder, because someone in Ontario is not going to want to get up at 9 o'clock in the morning Newfoundland time to attend one of my lectures. So this winter was my first experience teaching in this kind of remote session where it's not really online, but it's definitely not face-to-face. And based on my kind of normal background as an educational developer, I was very aware of a lot of the feedback that we were getting from students based on like the spring, summer, fall semesters during the pandemic. So there were a few specific things that I saw the opportunity to really try to work with. One, which I think everyone was aware of, was the call for a reduced workload. So a lot of students coming into the fall they just have way too much on their plate, too many assignments, too many kind of individual assignments going on. And there was a lot of students struggling because of this. I wanted to try to provide a bit more guidance and scaffolding because of this kind of remote environment. There is a call for more flexibility with students living in different time zones and dealing with care of parents or care of dependents, kids out of school, this kind of thing. And one of the big ones I wanted to try to tackle was instilling some kind of sense of community. So a lot of students felt very disconnected, not only from their instructors, but from everyone else in the class. So how did I try to do these things? So my plan going in was that I used a workload estimator tool. And if you're not really sure what that is, it's basically an online tool where you can plug in, how many assignments you have, how much reading you have, how many tests you have, these kinds of things. And then it will say approximately how many hours of work that would be for a student. So that was my first time using the workload estimator. So I used that to try to better gauge the workload for students. And I aimed at keeping everything 10 hours a week or under. And especially for the first few weeks, I really wanted to stick with just like 4 hours or so. So not too much outside of what would be normal class time. And in an effort to kind of help find that balance of workload, I built in a lot more student feedback into the course. So usually I would only check in with students maybe 2 or 3 times throughout the semester to get some feedback from them about my teaching. And this semester I decided to have weekly feedback. So I built it into an assignment that was due every week. With more guidance and scaffolding, I wanted to really establish a routine that was the same every week and just provide a lot of practice opportunities for different types of questions. More flexibility. I ended up doing a lot more asynchronous than I think in the end that I would have liked. But this allowed for a lot of flexibility with my students who were spread across the country and in some cases in different parts of the world. And instilling that sense of community, I decided to follow a very formal version of team-based learning, which in itself increased communication. And then on top of that, I also made a bit more effort than I normally would to reach out to different students that looked like they might be struggling a little bit. I played a little bit more of the kind of big brother role in looking at student progress through D2L to see what content they were accessing, when the last time they were on the site was, this kind of thing, to see if there were any students kind of falling through the cracks, and I would reach out to them. So I'm not going to go through all of how team-based learning worked or how the model that I used worked, but you'll be able to see a little bit of it in the routine. And if anybody has questions about it later, I don't mind answering them and chatting about it. So here is the basic routine for the week for my class. I tried to stick with the Monday, Wednesday, Friday slots so that I wasn't eating into any other classes. So anything I assigned as normal classwork, I tried to make sure that it would fit within that hour. So if a student really wanted to, they could get up at 9 and work from 9 to 10 on the course, and then it would be done and it wouldn't be overlapping with other things. This is, of course, apart from what would be expected for their regular study hours outside of class. So on Monday and Wednesdays, they had pre-class reading or media. So sometimes they would be watching a video or something like that as well. And after that, they would have an individual readiness quiz based on that content. And this was a way to kind of make sure that they understood the basics of what they were presented with in order to understand the next step of the content, which was introduced in a mini lecture. So I chose to go with mini lectures. They're asynchronous, so they're all pre-recorded, and they typically hovered around 20-25 minutes. So that happened on both Mondays and Wednesdays, those 3 things. And then the Friday, quote unquote, class was actually the time span from Tuesday to Sunday, and that was for their team activities. And I really had to get after myself throughout the semester to not say group, and I just kept saying team because I really felt it had a different context. So they're team-based activities, and they were very much teams, included a team readiness quiz, which reflected the content that was from the Monday and Wednesday lectures. Classes, everything involved in the classes, the reading and the readiness quiz, and then the lecture. And that team readiness quiz kind of got everybody kind of up to speed so they could discuss things as the group, and they had to try to come to a consensus with the answers. So that way everybody was ready to go when it came time to work on the problem. Groups then were able to choose a time in between that Tuesday morning and Sunday midnight, basically, to meet, and they were requested to meet synchronously for about an hour. We did have some students who kind of couldn't meet synchronously, and we worked with those groups to find alternatives so that everybody still was doing this equal amount of work. And that was just a couple exceptions in the class of 50 students. After the readiness quiz, they had an application team problem that they worked on. Some teams chose to work asynchronously a bit first, and then they met to kind of finalize the work, and some teams met first and then they worked asynchronously, like with a Google Doc or something like that, to finalize their answer. And each team member took a turn being the team lead for every week, and that would be the person who would, chat with me if something was confusing or they had questions, or, and that person would be in charge of submitting the final answers. And then the last part of the team-based activities was an individual worksheet based on that teamwork. So this kind of helped prevent, someone kind of floating by based on other people's work, because in the end, you still had to go through and do an individual worksheet through the quiz tool on Brightspace, and answer questions about that application problem. So it was in your best interest to participate and make sure that you understood what was going on during that teamwork. And then I have the little note there that the last question of every worksheet was where I put my student feedback. So that meant I was getting feedback from students every week, and that was really a godsend for me during this course. Just a little add-on, some extras of some things that I do in other semesters as well. So I had a frequently asked questions page in the discussions. That always helps with not getting asked the same thing numerous times. I did have some review questions that were or classes that were synchronous. And I made a fairly heavy use of the announcement tool in Brightspace. So we had announcements usually once or twice a week, so that I was constantly kind of making sure that everybody was up to speed with what was happening. For the teamwork, the teams also had team member evaluations 2 times, once within the first month, and that wasn't worth any points, but it served as kind of both a practice for using that tool. So we used Peer Scholar. So a practice for using that tool, as well as an opportunity to provide some early feedback to your group members, so that if anybody, wasn't quite pulling, their weight with the group or wasn't really talking much during the meetings, there was an opportunity to troubleshoot that right from the get-go. And I was told by many students that that was an enormous help. And then, of course, I had a midterm exam, and I do have a fairly traditional midterm and exam, with the exception that maybe a lot of the questions are application-based. But other than that, it's pretty standard. So how did all that go? Well, the pre-class reading and media, I very much overestimated how much work I thought they could do. And that was even despite using the workload estimator. So for my particular course and content, that did not work for me. Students were spending way more time reading than I thought they would be. So we ended up having to decrease that quite significantly, which threw off a lot of my course at first, because it meant that there were things that I thought they could cover in the readings that I wouldn't have to cover in the lectures. And all of a sudden there was a lot more stuff that I needed to be able to fit in other aspects of the course. The readiness quizzes for both the individuals and teams went fine. It gave students an opportunity to really kind of practice some of the questions that they would end up seeing on the midterm and exams. The asynchronous mini lectures, students really liked that they were short, but they were a little confused about some of the main points that they would have to know for studying, like a lot of students are. What do I need to know for the exam? So I did end up adding in lecture notes that I didn't initially have, so that was based on student feedback. Team application problem was a lot like the readings. I overestimated how long that would take. My first week I had one group, because I asked them in the worksheet how long things were taking them, and they said, oh, it took a little long. Our group met for like 4 hours. I was like, what? Like, no, I don't want you to meet for 4 hours. So we had to, or I had to adjust that for sure. And because of the amount of work that was involved in the team questions, some students requested that the worksheet not have long answer questions in it. So those were switched over to the readiness quizzes instead, and the worksheet was just multiple choice to speed up that a little bit. And for other things, the team member evaluations, it took me a little while to kind of wrap my head around Peer Scholar, because any peer stuff I had done in the past, I had used a different program called Peerceptive. So kind of, just that learning curve of getting used to a new program, and not many of these programs are super intuitive. But once I got everything set up, it worked really well, and I was able to get some kind of preset questions for group member evaluations that worked really well for me as well. And
we just had a question come in.
Yeah, no problem.
So how many hours a week did you start with when you used the workload estimator?
Yeah, so for the first 2 weeks of the course, I was aiming for 4 hours a week. And the students knew that this was going to increase to around 8 is what I was aiming for. I didn't want to go over 10. Yeah, but the workload estimator did not necessarily work for me. And I think a lot of it was because it is an introductory course. So even though it's a 3rd-year course, they're presented with so much new material and new concepts and new terms. And it's like learning a new language in addition to learning these new mechanisms and theories and everything. And so I think it takes a lot longer to digest that kind of material when it's written out than I would have thought. So I did end up kind of expanding stuff out. All right. And the last thing was the midterm exam. And I don't know how many of you were doing open book, open web, but this was my first time doing open book, open web online. And it was very, very hard to try to get the timing of the exam correct. Because normally during a term, I would kind of lowball the amount for a midterm or exam so that I knew my students had lots of time to read over questions, and I do a lot of application questions, so there is usually a lot of writing involved, and yeah, so sometimes I'd have students only using half of the exam time and then they'd walk out of the classroom. But for this, because it was open book, open web, I didn't want students going and looking up answers from the text for every single question. I wanted them to be able to recall these mechanisms and recall, how these systems worked. And maybe just use the book and online for a quick lookup of what exactly was that protein called. But other than that, I wanted them to be able to do things quickly. So that meant I ended up using a fairly tight timeline. And what I ended up doing for the students was telling them that if, when I'm marking the exam, if it's obvious that people were running out of time, and you can see it very easily, even if they have stuff written in, there's like typos galore and it looks very rushed, that I would adjust the marks to kind of reflect that time. So for the midterm in particular, I was aiming for a particular average and I did shift the marks according to that, because I didn't think it was fair for them to kind of have to pay the price for me having an overly long exam. All right, so I am going to switch gears a little bit here, and I'm going to go over to an application called Padlet. All right, so this is Padlet, and this is just, I've filled out some of it already with my own experience. My biggest success was getting that weekly student feedback. That's made such a huge difference for me, and that's definitely something I'll continue into the future. What I've learned is a lot more about estimating how much time it takes to do things, for students to do things. What I will keep is that team-based learning. I really enjoyed that, and the student feedback around it was phenomenal. They really felt so much better having a group that they worked with through the whole semester. And even students who usually hate group work, I got very positive responses about that. Application questions worked really well for me. I did a bit more of them this term than I normally would do, simply because of the open book, open web aspect of assessments. What I would leave behind, I didn't mention this in the first go through, but at first I had threshold barriers set up in Brightspace so that students couldn't access certain parts of the course until they completed other parts. So in particular, they couldn't access the lecture for a given day until they did the readiness quiz. And through student feedback, we ended up abandoning it because some students really wanted to start off with the lecture. Even though I kind of jumped them ahead in the content a little bit, they felt it really helped set them up better to understand some of the readings. And some students, they might have missed one day, but they wanted to jump right to the next day so that they would be ready for their group work a little bit more. And so we ended up kind of abandoning those threshold barriers. And my only additional thoughts is that I'm still really undecided on the pre-recorded lectures. I didn't mind the mini lectures so much, but I'm sure as many of you know, they took a horrendous amount of time to make. And yeah, I'm just not sure if I would want to continue with those when we go back face to face, maybe for some supplementary material, but I'm not sold on those yet. All right, so what we're going to do now is we are going to shift out into breakout groups. So we have 32 participants right now, so that will give us a fair number of groups. 30. Oh, we just lost 2. Everyone's like, breakout groups. Okay, let me say right first, you don't have to go to a breakout group if you don't want to. I will be staying in the main room. You can feel free to sit here with me and I'll be looking at the Padlet as people add to it. So don't run away because you don't like breakout groups. It's not a problem. If you want to participate in the breakout group, we will set them up. So it always comes up on your screen of whether or not you want to join it. You can always say no. And like I said, just hang out here with me. But I basically want you with your group to kind of work through the Padlet prompts a little bit. So biggest success, what you've learned, what you'll keep, what you'll leave behind. So have a look at those. We will, let's see here, it's 2:40 now. So maybe we'll give you about 15 minutes for that. Does that sound good, Dylan?
That should be good, yep.
All right, so 5 people a group for 15 minutes. And I will recopy the link to the Padlet to put in the chat for your breakout group as well. All right, so Dylan, you are free to set that up. Yeah, so for the next few minutes, I'm going to let us have a little bit of an awkward silence or random chats while people can go in if they didn't have a chance to do so during their breakout session, that they can go in and fill in some more stuff in the Padlet. And I will be keeping this Padlet up for the unforeseeable future until I run out of space on Padlet and have to get rid of it for some reason a couple years down the road. So it's a nice thing that you can kind of come back to as you're planning other courses and kind of have a look and see what some other people learned from their own experiences and see if it's something that you want to incorporate into your own future planning. So that will be available to you. Just take that link and save it somewhere so that you're bookmark the page and you can come back to it anytime. And if you have finished filling out, use this time to have a peruse through some of the stuff that's filled in there. There are little like buttons if you wanted to kind of put yourself behind a comment that you kind of relate to, and see if anything kind of surprises you. I'm curious about this one here. The casual communication was harder. Reminders and chat need to be organized. I'm just kind of curious if anyone's willing to speak to it. What educational technologies or what tools you were using, and maybe just what that experience was. Or if anyone else has had similar experience, they're welcome to speak to it as well.
Hi, Amy and all. This is Lori Hogan. I'm over in engineering.
Hi.
I wasn't course instructor for our Intro to Programming course, the winter. I was the lab instructor, but the course instructor was using Top Hat as a polling tool. But one of the side features, I guess, of that is like a community chat type thing. So it's to me, it's really very much like Slack, or I maybe Discord. I'm not using that, but a lot of the students are. And it did provide the opportunity for students to like drop a note either generally to everybody in the course or direct it to one of us. And at the beginning of the semester, it was used a fair bit, but as the semester wore on, less students were using it. But at the start, it was a good sort of informal chat type tool.
Mm. Yeah, I know with my teams, I feel like every one of them chose a different way to communicate. And a few of them were using Discord and a few other just verbal tools. And then some of them were using WebEx or Zoom and things like that. But it was interesting to see what they chose and then their group kind of feedback on how things were going. And the more organized the application problem was in like how it broke down a question made a big difference in how they communicated during the problem, like just kind of guiding them through the discussion a little bit more. But also the groups who weren't doing visual found it so much harder, and a lot of them, yeah, voiced that in the feedback, and a few of the groups actually switched to a different tool. So yeah, I think organizing your chats also really depends on what technology you end up using, and what kind of scaffolding or whatnot you need based on that technology. Well, I had cats meowing in the background here. Apologies. So some people are still putting in a few things here. As mentioned, I will keep this maintained so you can come back to it at any time. I don't anticipate having to delete it in the next few years, so feel free to come back to it. And if you have any issue with Ruth posting it up for others to see and contribute to, if that's something you would rather not do, just send me an email there. My email's in the chat, or you can send a private chat during this session. So you just go and select, instead of everyone, you can just select me and send me a note there that you would rather it be kept just to the individuals in this session. I'm wondering, well, I'll give you a couple options. One, if anyone wants to speak to anything that they particularly wanted to share, but my question to try to prompt some sharing is, yeah, whether or not you see something here that really resonates with you, or something that was particularly surprising, or if there's something that was brought up in your groups that was particularly resonating with you or was surprising to you. And we'll do the awkward silence for a little bit, and then I'll start picking on people I know. Be forewarned, Adrian.
I'll just say I was surprised, Amy, it's Ruth. I was surprised at how many people had indicated that they're going to leave their recordings behind. When I know students valued, in some of the feedback we did through the student questionnaire, students did value those recordings as a resource, not necessarily as replacement of instruction. So if some folks who put that in, that they were going to leave the recordings behind, if they could share why they chose to leave it behind, why they chose to shift away from it, it'd be great.
I can say from my own experience that I won't be doing recordings the way that I did. I think I just use them for particularly difficult concepts as a little bit of a supplementary, maybe, that people can go back to over and over again. And in the past, I had used lecture capture in my classes, because I was always in one of those big classrooms. And I know my students really liked that. It was a little bit of a double-edged sword in that it sometimes impacted attendance, until we had one day when the lecture capture didn't work, and then they all learned their lesson that they should actually show up, because it's not to be depended on 100%. But yeah, I have a feeling I'd probably go back to lecture capture, and then maybe only record extra resources for particularly difficult concepts.
Can I just ask a question to whoever put it in on the Padlet? Wonder what I will leave behind. By the way, hi, I'm Kim Myrick. I'm with CITL and Faculty of Business. Threshold barriers for accessing course content. I'm trying
That
to.
would be mine.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's that option that you have in Brightspace, where you can say they can't move on to this content until they've completed this one.
Right.
And I originally had that set up as kind of extra scaffolding for students, and they did not like it. or the vocal ones did not like it anyway. So very quickly, that was one of the first things that was changed based on student feedback, was we got rid of that so that they had the ability to kind of float around with the content a bit more. And the reason I had it there in the first place was I wanted to make sure that nobody was coming into their group work or their teamwork unprepared. Yeah, apparently, I guess it didn't really become a problem. Like I didn't have any reports back from groups that because people could float around with content, it didn't seem like anybody was coming in particularly unprepared. So it ended up not being a problem.
Interesting. Thanks, Amy.
You have about 5 minutes left there, Amy.
All right. I guess I'll just kind of open it up for any comments or questions about anything that I did or anything that you see up here. And if anybody wants to know more about the team-based stuff that I did, that particular approach, and doesn't want to chat about it here, feel free to connect with me later. I'm happy to walk you through how that works. It's a pretty standard for a lot of team-based learning, but I did follow a particular protocol.
Amy, can I just ask a quick question? So for your teams, you kept the same teams throughout the semester, I think you said. How much effort did you put into creating the teams?
So normally, I would go in and, like in a normal semester, I would go in and try to have a diverse group as much as possible. So usually I'd put the teamwork back a few weeks in the semester so that I can get like a quiz or two in, so I can get a little bit of a gauge on people's prior learning experiences. And sometimes I haven't done it recently, but you can also put out a survey asking students different questions to try to organize them into groups. And maybe Ruth is aware of some applications, but I know there are applications that will automatically do that for you out there. Ruth is not nodding her head vigorously, so maybe she's not aware. But for this one, for this year, I ended up completely abandoning that, and I went with basically time availability. So I actually set up a matchmaker kind of dating thing through the discussion groups in Brightspace, so that people could post up maybe what time zone they were in, what time of day they're able to work, whether they're a morning person or a night hawk. And then I let them kind of match themselves up with people that would be available when they wanted to be able to work on the team stuff. Because that, to me, for the remote work, ended up being the big kind of hurdle to get over. So that's how students match themselves up. I had one student that I ended up switching groups because they ended up being in a group with someone that they had a prior personal conflict with. And I had one group that was a bit small that I ended up chatting with them and dividing them up into other spaces. But other than that, yeah, all the groups went really well. It was probably the best experience I've had with group creation and conflict. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Oh, Ruth is putting something up. How to communication group tool. There you go.
I will share our client support team. There's a whole workshop on how to use some of the more advanced features of the groups tool in Brightspace if folks did want to learn a little bit more about it.
Okay. Well, there's only a couple minutes left, but I do want to say thank you to everyone for coming out.